Welcome to the fourth of six 2020 Wonder Grant presentations. We're happy you could join us. What is a Wonder Grant? At One Workplace, we're curious about the thinkers and makers, the research and insights, the purposes, culture shifts, and trends that impact spaces where we work, learn, heal, and innovate. And we believe when we partner with pioneers, experts, and disruptors, when we question the status quo, we do our best work to ultimately shape the human experience and built environments more enjoyable. We introduced the Wonder Grant in 2019 to support the exploration and research by the architecture and design community into unique topics of interest and passion, and we have awarded 9 Wonder Grants since then. 6 grants were awarded in 2020. I'm Chris Wiegand, Director of Sales in our San Francisco office, and I am honored to introduce one of the 2020 grant teams to you, Siegel and Strain. As a support coach for this team, along with my colleague, Saren Pearson, we watched their work progress over the past 9 months, and we are certain their insights will help conscientious leaders make data-driven decisions to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with building reuse, renovation, and new construction. But before I introduce the team, let me share a few logistics. At the end of Siegel and Strain's presentation, we will have a brief Q&A period. The Q&A function will be throughout, so during the presentation, please put your questions there. We will send out the recording of today's presentation within 24 hours, and it will also be available in the Wonder Grant section of the One Workplace website with all of the other grant teams. Now, to share the research into to build or not to build carbon calculator, please meet Larry Strain from Siegel and Strain, Lori Ferris from Goody Clancy, and part of the group, but not on the panel today, was Aaron McDade from Architecture 2030. Larry?
All right, thank you. Let me share my screen. Ooh, here we go. Okay, good morning. We are excited to be here. This has been a journey. I'm going to give brief introductions and then we'll get to our presentation. I'm Larry Strain of Siegel and Strain. We've been practicing sustainable design for the last 30 years or so, and for the last 10 years, I've been really focused on reducing carbon emissions in the built environment. Erin McDade is a Senior Program Director for Architecture 2030, and she and I have been talking about and presenting on embodied carbon for at least the last 5 or 6 years together. Lori Ferris is Director of Sustainability at Goody Clancy. As an architect, engineer, and conservator, she brings deep understanding on both policy and technical knowledge to the fields of historic architecture and sustainable design. I got to know Lori through the Zero Net Carbon Collaborative, which I'll mention a little bit more in a few minutes. And I really want to acknowledge Chris and Saren for their unflagging support and encouragement for helping us stay focused on this, which turned out to be, as usual, a bigger task than anybody thought it would be. All right, let's. So you may have seen a pie chart like this before. It's basically, it shows the annual global greenhouse gas emissions by end use. And what it shows is that the buildings make up about 40% of those emissions on a global scale. And I've seen this a lot, and mostly talks about operating emissions and embodied emissions. And the point we like to make with this chart is where those emissions come from. Operating emissions are from existing buildings, because you can't have an emission from a building until it's built. The embodied emissions are almost all from new buildings. So one way to bring those two down is to reduce the operating emissions of existing buildings and build fewer new buildings. Remodel more buildings, which will let you build fewer new buildings, which will reduce the embodied emissions from new buildings. Reusing and upgrading what we have is going to be a key strategy to solving the climate emergency we are in. It accomplishes these two things. The upgrade part reduces current operating emissions from existing buildings, The reuse part makes it possible to build fewer new buildings, thereby reducing future embodied emissions as well. But to date, we haven't had a tool that could compare all the variables for embodied carbon and operating carbon over different timeframes. Retrofitting an existing building to zero net emissions will always be the lowest carbon option. But what if you can only prove its efficiency by 50%? What if you can replace it with a new net zero emission building? Does it still make sense to retrofit, or should you build a new one? And how does climate, grid efficiency affect those calculations? So we set out to create a simple, easy to use tool that could compare all of the carbon emissions, operating, embodied, and avoided emissions of a new building, a building retrofit, and an existing building. We wanted to be able to compare a variety of existing and new and reuse scenarios over different timeframes. And I should say that the current version is really an estimating tool for planners and building owners. It's not actually a design tool that can be used by designers in the early stages. It's really to tell you whether you should be building a new building at all or retrofitting what you have. So a little bit about the project history and how we started. The catalyst for our calculator was an ex-employee of Siegel and Strain who was working for the Office of the President at the University of California. He called me up one day and asked me if I knew of a tool they could use to estimate total carbon emissions in the early planning stages of a project. I told him we all wanted a tool like that, and as far as I knew, it didn't exist. Life cycle assessment tools like Tally need a building that's already designed. He wanted a tool that could help them decide whether to design and build a building in the first place. I got to thinking about it, and I knew something about embodied carbon emissions, not as much about operating emissions, so I called another ex-employee and some mechanical engineers I knew and got some rough emission numbers for building operations and made this very simple calculator in Excel that could also graph out the results. So this one had a few choices you could make about your existing building assumption, what's your new efficient building. It gives you the two different kinds of emissions, embodied and operating, for different new buildings and different retrofit buildings. So I took this calculator and showed it to the people at the Carbon Positive Conference in Chicago in October of 2019. And Erin McDade of Architecture 2030 thought it had promise and offered to help. And unlike me, Erin actually knew how to use Excel, and she came back with this version, which referenced national energy consumption databases, climate zones, grid efficiencies for baseline operating emissions. It was way more sophisticated and way more useful. This version allowed you to select one of two replacement buildings. You could either select a light wood frame building or a heavy concrete or steel building, and it assumed that your retrofit was just involving the interiors and the systems, building systems, but nothing else. So it was pretty limited, but it worked pretty well, and it gave you all these different outputs, and we were pretty happy with it. We showed it around, and there was a lot of interest in this tool, particularly from a group of historic building architects who were just forming the Zero Net Carbon Collaborative, which is a group of historic architects primarily who were really focused on existing buildings as one of the key solutions to climate emergency, climate change. People wanted to get their hands on it, but we knew it wasn't really ready for prime time yet. So the current version, we heard about a grant. A friend of mine told me about a grant program from one workplace that was giving out innovation grants to firms working on the built environment. In August, we applied for it and received a ONEder grant to continue to develop the tool. Erin and I added Lori Ferris from Goody Clancy and one of the organizers of the Zero Net Carbon Collaborative to our core team, and we put together a high-powered advisory committee as well. We called our tool the To Build or Not to Build carbon calculator and got to work refining it. Our goals were to define the emissions for various build types of existing buildings to set the baseline, to define the emissions for a range of remodeling and retrofit options, and to define the emissions for a range of new replacement buildings, not just the two we had started with. So the way that the existing buildings work is there's a database out there. There's two databases out there. One's called CBEX and one's called REX, and these are the Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey and the Residential Energy Consumption Survey. And these have been going on for a long time. The Department of Energy the Energy Information Administration publishes these results every 5 to 10 years. And they do a survey of all these different types of buildings and set the baseline energy consumption for those buildings. So that gives us a place to start. If we're starting with an office building, we're looking at whether to replace it. We know what the baseline emissions for that building should be. Then we came up with 4 new building types. We wanted 4 distinct types of buildings that had different embodied carbon footprints. And really, these are based on they're based on size, materials, and structural systems, not really the building use. So the light wood frame building, which is typically a house, but doesn't have to be, it could be a commercial building, has an embodied carbon footprint of about this range. The mixed wood concrete, so it's a mixed wood. Usually this is something like a wood frame building over a concrete parking deck for residential, low-rise residential. And we have a mid-rise concrete and steel building. And we have a high carbon building, which typically are either really tall buildings or very carbon intensive buildings like blast proof buildings and things like that. So we had this range of buildings. So you pick the building that you're thinking most matches what you would replace your existing building with. And that's where you set your baseline for the new building. Let's see here. Then we came up with a menu of different items, different retrofit options for what you could do to your building. There's MEP upgrades, there's envelope upgrades, interiors, different types of interiors. We wanted this to stay very simple, but just to give us a quick check on what you would do to this the building if you're going to remodel it. Each one of these has a different embodied carbon footprint. Each one of these boxes comes with a different footprint. Then you can set your operational emissions. Your baseline building is set by your CBEX or REX databases. And your retrofit is you're just picking your target, how much better you think you're going to be than that. And so your mechanical engineer, you work with that and get a sense of the new buildings basically. So you're going for better than the existing building for the retrofit. And the new building's basically set by code average for Title 24 or ASHRAE 90.1. So these are probably about twice as good as these existing buildings to start with. That's your baseline. And then you can go from better than that. So you get to set where you think you're going to be. And all that plots out, if you put all that data in your building, it plots out where you are. So I'm going to hand it over to Lori to show you that in a minute, but I wanted to talk a little bit about where we started when we applied for this grant. These were our goals and the methodology we set out to look at this with. We needed to collect construction and emissions data for both new buildings and renovation projects. We needed to collect life cycle assessment data for both new and renovation projects. We wanted to then review and update all of our emission assumptions, which we'd put into this based on our own knowledge of LCA and life cycle assessment. We wanted to add more building types than just the 2 we started with, and a lot of remodeling options. We didn't have any of those except for just for building interiors. And ultimately, we wanted to convert the Excel-based calculator into a web-based tool. We haven't achieved that last goal yet, but we're well on the way to achieving all these others. And the primary use was really high-level decision-making at early design stages. This is not a design tool. I want to make that clear. It's really to let you know, should we be building a new building or not? So we set up some focus groups to help us sort through the data and figure out what data we needed. And one of them was the energy mechanical focus group. And since we're not mechanical engineers, we mostly just asked them questions like what are typical mechanical systems for new buildings and building retrofits? How do they vary by use, size, and climate? What are the issues with electrifying existing buildings? And then we wanted to come up with some initial estimates for embodied carbon for each of those different kinds of mechanical systems. So we could plug those into our embodied carbon baseline. And we wanted to know some typical energy use intensities for new buildings, retrofits, and things like that. So mostly we're asking them questions, and we're now starting to get input and feedback back from this group. So at this point, what I'd like to do is hand it off to Lori to talk about the next focus group and lead into then a presentation of a project. So go to there.
Yeah, so in addition to that MEP focus group, we also convened an existing buildings focus group. And this was really to talk to preservation and building reuse experts to understand, how is the tool responding to all of the parameters and the challenges of reusing existing buildings. And the feedback we got from this group was actually similar to feedback we've gotten from our primary advisory group and from the MEP group. First off, which was that the value of this tool was really as a high level tool as that first step in understanding total carbon, not as a design tool. So that was important to keep as a focus. And one request was that it would be nice to allow users to understand which factors within those drop-down menus have the biggest impact. So if you are going to reuse a building or build new and you want to do better, what are the levers to pull to really show improvement? Again, going back to interface, it's really important to be able to see all of the options and results on a single page so that it was very easy to understand and digest. Consider this next point, consider rangers rather than absolutes. It's really about providing drop-down selections that reflect what people are seeing, because the people using this tool may not be technical experts. It's important that they see options that reflect what they're familiar with and what their project actually looks like. And the last is about coordinating with other embodied carbon tools out there. So there are existing LCA tools. There are a lot of tools being developed, a lot of design tools and life cycle assessment tools. So how do we make sure that the data is all aligned so that you can move seamlessly from one tool to the next and you're really comparing apples to apples? Next.
Oh, am I?
Oh yeah, can you keep advancing?
I have to advance, is that right?
Yes.
There we go.
Next
Okay.
slide, thank you. Thanks. So this is where we landed. This is the current Excel user interface of the carbon calculator. You can see on the left side, those gray boxes are all of the inputs, which I'll walk through, and on the right side are the results. And this is really, at the top, the general project and building information. Below that is a box about the renovation. What's the scope of the renovation and what kind of energy efficiency are you aiming to achieve? The next box is all about the new building, the hypothetical replacement building. And then at the bottom are embodied emissions modifiers. And these are important because there are a lot of factors like poor soils or blast resistance or factors that really impact embodied carbon, but it's kind of impossible to capture all of them in a drop down. So the point of these was to allow you to check a box that makes this simple tool as broadly applicable to a wide range of projects as possible. Okay, so I'm going to walk through a project example to really show you how this works. Next. And the building we're looking at here is a 1950s international style building, which was purpose-built as a Hillel Center for Boston University and was renovated in 2014 into an admissions center. Next slide. So this was a comprehensive renovation. It included completely reconfiguring the interiors, and it also involved a lot of performance upgrades. So new high performance glazing, insulation at all of the walls, as well as the roofs, and new high efficiency building systems. But through all of this work, the majority of the original structure and enclosure were preserved and restored. And through the project, the operational efficiency of the building was improved by 70%. Next slide.
Okay.
All right, so we can start to enter this, model this using the tool. That first box, the project information, you can see we start with the location, and this is to pull from that CBEX database, the climate zone that you're in. We then ask for the primary use type, and the CBEX use type then gives you a range of what the expected energy use might be based on what the building is primarily used for. And then square footage and operational timeline. And the operational timeline is really important because this is, when we're talking about the need to get to carbon neutral by 2050 and to make really, greater than 50% reductions within the next 10 years, it's important to define that duration that we're looking at for total carbon emissions. So here we're saying 15 years.
Sorry.
Are all about the renovation. So both for the renovation and new construction, we have a floor area box where you can enter the floor area, and this is because we know that typically when you reuse a building, the floor area changes. And if you demolish and replace it, you're likely adding square footage. So we want to be able to capture that variable here. The next set of efficiency upgrades and renovation drop-down menus are all about embodied carbon of the renovation. So this gives you options for what different renovation strategies might look like. In this case, for example, we're replacing all of the MEP systems. We're doing a major upgrade of the envelope. We're gutting the interior, et cetera, and each of those decisions results in some embodied carbon emissions. And then at the bottom, you can input your operational performance, and here we're showing 80% better than baseline, but this is really the performance target or what level of energy efficiency you're aiming for, which then the calculator converts to operational carbon emissions based on your your locale and your grid data. Next. The next option, the next input box is about the new building. This one's a little bit simpler. As Larry mentioned, we provide the floor area here, and then you choose from one of those four building types. So here, this is that mid-rise concrete or steel, typical construction, and then the performance target. And here I'm comparing this to an 80% better than baseline. So this is almost a net zero building. Just for the sake of comparison, we're saying that this is a very, very high performance new building. Next. And in this case, there aren't any embodied emissions modifiers, but you could imagine that, if we had used low carbon concrete, for example, the embodied carbon would go down, or if we had poor soils, it would go up. Next. And the first chart, this is one of the result charts. I'll start with the more detailed one to walk you through. You can see these three columns. On the left is this is total carbon emissions over that 15 years that we input. On the left is the existing building if you do nothing to it. In the middle is the retrofit scenario that we defined. And on the right is the replacement scenario. You can see in the sort of dark yellow and dark blue are the embodied emissions and the operational emissions. So these are emissions that are coming from each of these projects. And then the light blue and the light yellow are the avoided emissions. So these are all of the emissions that we're saving essentially by the decisions we make. So, for example, the existing building has no blue if you do nothing to it because there's no embodied carbon added. It's just operating as it always has been. Whereas if you retrofit a building, there's some embodied carbon emissions. And if you replace it, there are usually substantially more embodied carbon emissions. And then looking at those light numbers, you're avoiding emissions, you're avoiding operational emissions by improving energy efficiency, and you're avoiding embodied emissions by reusing the existing building fabric rather than replacing it with new material. Next. And if that's a little bit too much granularity of data, you can also see the total carbon just summed for each of those options. So you can really quickly see that for the next 15 years, retrofitting the existing building results in a much greater carbon savings than replacing with high performance new construction. And then lastly, we've added a chart here that shows what those emissions look like over time. So in this chart, each of the lines represents one of those scenarios. The red line is the existing building, the green line is the renovated building, and the blue line is the replacement building. And at year zero, those values represent the embodied carbon. So, when you build a new building, that results in the highest embodied carbon of the three options. And then the slope of each line is really the operational efficiency, or how much carbon is emitted over time due to operating the building. And if you remember from your high school math, the area under the curve represents the total carbon emissions by any of the years indicated here. And so you can basically see at any point in time from the year of renovation, which option results in the lowest total carbon emissions. So in this case, reusing the existing building is the lowest carbon option for the next 20 years. But you can imagine how the embodied carbon, so that starting point and the slope might change depending on those different decisions or drop-down menu selections you make. Next slide. So that's where we are now. This is still a work in progress. There's plenty to do, and we're still working. So next slide. We've started to solicit feedback from our beta testers. We've sent the spreadsheet as it is to those people in our advisory groups, as well as others who have been helping us along the way. We've received some feedback. First, about interface. It would be nice to be able to compare options. And I guess I'll preface this by saying that most of this feedback comes from technical experts and practitioners, especially. So we found that people want more detail and more options for their own use. But this, they like to see multiple renovation options against each other. We definitely understand that it would be helpful to have more mechanical systems options, again, so that when you select something in the dropdown, it reflects the choices that you're actually presented with in real life. People would like to be able to enter their own energy use intensity and embodied carbon rather than have those as dropdowns, so that they can, if they have that data, they can input it. And we've had many requests for an advanced user option, whether that's a separate tab or sort of in a web interface, a button you could check that allows you more granularity. And this again is as Larry mentioned, this is not a design tool, but the more we talk to practitioners, the more that they want it to be, they would like some design tool capabilities here. So that could be a next step. And then on the data front, we've had requests to incorporate future grid emissions data, because we know the grid, electric grids everywhere are becoming cleaner. So linking to databases to reflect that. as well as locating, using that location to tie to local energy code requirements and data so that the energy performance inputs are less of a guess and more based on the requirements in your jurisdiction. Next.
Let's see here.
We're also collecting data. There are a lot of data assumptions built into this calculator, and we're trying to validate them by collecting information about real projects that practitioners are providing to us. And this ranges from data that you see reflected in drop-down menus, but also sort of deeper data so that we can make sure we're showing the right drop-down menus, that we're correlating the selections to the right data, the right outputs, that sort of thing. So next slide. I'm showing what we're asking for, just so you get a sense of the detail that we're requesting. So a lot of existing building information here, renovation information, sort of what's the strategy you're taking and how much material are you replacing, what level of structural and cladding replacement and upgrade, and what are you doing to the building interiors. Next. Efficiency upgrades, what are you doing? How are you treating the envelope? Are you improving the windows, and what strategies are you using? Are you applying insulation? What kind of systems are you using? And then even what are the attributes of your building envelope? So, what R value have you achieved with your walls, that sort of thing, so we can really make sure we're building in the right data to the calculator. And lastly, life cycle assessment information. And this is probably the biggest gap in existing data, but really understanding the embodied carbon associated with different building reuse decisions in particular, so that we make sure that we're accurately reflecting the embodied carbon of the retrofit scenarios within the tool.
That's it.
Ready for questions?
All right.
Thanks.
So.
Sorry, I had a little bit of course technical difficulties there. I apologize. Thank you, Lori and Larry. That has given us actually a lot to think about. So I do have a couple questions through the Q&A chat, but Sarah, and I am going to pass this off to you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sarah Pearson. Lori and Larry, thank you so much. You gave us a lot to process. I would like to ask you a little bit about the audience. You talked about how a lot of your first rounds of feedback have come from subject matter experts. And I was curious kind of what you envision moving forward with the tool.
Yeah, I think that we've said that this tool is really designed more for developers and building owners and planners because it's that kind of level. But to be frank, it's hard to get input from. We haven't had as much input from that group as we'd like, so we'd like that group to start to test it out. One group that might be great to send it back to now that it's at this stage is the University of California, since they came to us and said, we need a tool to look at all the buildings on all our campuses and see what we should be doing with it. And I think this tool has the potential to look at whole portfolios, not just single buildings. So you could take a portfolio of buildings, and University of California could take all their dorm buildings and assign it one embodied carbon level, and then just say, what would we do if we remodeled these or replaced them all? What would that look like? And I think that's probably the next step, is to get those kinds of people and maybe city planners involved in really vetting this tool to see if it works for them.
Sarah, you jump in and ask, I'll ask a quick question on this one from one of the people in the audience. Is the calculator available to try out online?
Well, it's not online yet, for sure. It's basically an Excel spreadsheet that we have to email to everyone who wants to use it. So right now we have sort of it's not a limited group, but we want to keep the group relatively small so we can sort of keep track of all the input as it comes in, probably for the next month or two. We're still updating some of our numbers. We're fine-tuning them. We've asked for more data from the mechanical engineers and some of those people to make sure we've got the right data in there. But we're trying to figure out when we want to release it just to anybody. Right now, there's probably about 20 or 30 people that are playing with this tool right now. Mm-hmm. And it won't be long. It'll be much easier when it's actually a web-based tool, because then anybody can just log in and try it out. So not quite there, but close.
Okay. Sarah, do you have any other questions? Because I have a couple more as well.
Yeah, I did want to ask about data gaps. Are there any areas that you are just finding it difficult to get the data that you need in the format that you need it? And what, if any, ideas you have about kind of filling those gaps?
You want to take that one, Lori? That feels
Yeah,
like it's existing
Sure.
buildings is still the
Yeah,
big one.
existing buildings. It's really like life cycle assessment data of renovation projects has been pretty hard to come by. Looking for, so if anyone out there in the audience listening has a project for which you've completed a life cycle assessment of a whole building renovation, we'd be really curious to see your data. But that's really I think the trickiest gap out there.
Yeah, the life cycle assessment really has been mostly been used by structural engineers to look at big impact things like the structural system of a building. They haven't even looked at full building LCAs very often. So it's hard to get this data. So we're getting the life cycle assessment for the different components of a building renovation, both by a life cycle assessment if we have one. If not, we sort of back it out by looking at a whole building LCA and saying, okay, here's the interiors, so we can assume that the interiors renovation would be about this number. So there's different ways to get at that number, but we'd love to have better information on building renovations.
I have another question here. What do you see as the biggest obstacle to wider scale acceptance? And how committed do you find the developer community?
I would say not very committed yet. I think, and I don't think it's because they're opposed to it. I think it's just a lack of understanding of sort of the relative difference of a new building versus a renovation. One of the things that was interesting to me when developing these tools, I always assumed the renovation was the better choice. And it turns out that if you can't get to the same level of operating efficiency with a renovated building as you can with a new building, and if you have to do a lot of structural upgrade to your existing building, it's not always the best choice. So one of the things we're hoping to let people know is that you really need to look at the total carbon, both the operating and embodied carbon that goes into either the renovation or the new building, and then make that call. The other thing about that I think this tool is really good for that Lori mentioned is the time component of this tool. If you look at a really efficient building, it always wins over a renovation after 50 or 100 years. We don't have 50 or 100 years. So we're looking at what the impacts are going to be for your project over the next 10 to 15 years, which is really kind of the window we have to make really big inroads in solving this. So what it leads you towards is that if you looked at those sloping lines at the end of Lori's presentation, even at the end, the renovation beat. But if you look at the beginning, the renovation was way better than the new building. So for the first 5 or 10 years, the renovation project is much lower than a new building because even if the efficiency is lower. So that's just a point that I think we need to get developers and cities and planners to recognize that this is a tool for figuring out what's the best thing to do now for the next 20 years.
We have another question. It says, how much longer do you think your development timeline is for a more complete tool? That was something that we talked about, obviously, for the last 9 months.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we'll have a beta version of this version, which is the Excel-based tool, probably in the next month or two, up and out there. People will have to find out how to reach it, get it out to people. But the next step is really then figuring out how to convert it to a web-based tool and how long that would take. Because then it becomes, you can find it on a website, you could link to it from our website, you can link to it from Architecture 2030, from ZNCC group. So that's, or Wonder, the ONEder grant people. I mean, there's various ways you can get to it. So I don't have an answer to that. We don't even have funding for this next phase of taking it to a web-based tool. But that is our next step. So I don't have an estimate, but one goal we have, which I don't know if we're going to make, but I'm hoping, is there's an idea that this tool may go to a COP26 conference in Glasgow in November. And so one idea is that we would, if we actually get to show this tool there, that's a pretty hard and fast deadline. So we would be working towards that deadline. We'll
We had
see.
a question come in from attendees about with the US re-entering the climate accord. Are you guys aware of any new legislations or state and federal drivers that might make the calculator, kind of more timely or have a wider audience?
I don't know if you've heard anything there, Lori, with sort of some of the existing building code things or historic building codes, whether there's any funding. I know that the architectural community, a bunch of sustainable architects sent an open letter to the Biden administration with a number of recommendations for how to move forward on climate around the built environment. And one of the subcategories of that letter was existing buildings. So there were a lot of recommendations in that letter saying existing buildings are a huge opportunity that really it could be part of the infrastructure bill for that matter. I mean, upgrading buildings just to keep them is great, but if you upgrade them and keep them and make them more efficient, you're solving a couple of problems at once. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity. I just don't know specifically what they are yet, but
Yeah.
I'm encouraged.
I think part of the challenge is that currently and in the past, most regulations and policies haven't dealt with embodied carbon because the data isn't out there and it's kind of complicated to calculate and people don't, it's been challenging to incorporate. So we're really just focused on efficiency. But now more and more jurisdictions, particularly at local levels and state levels within the US, are starting to include embodied carbon and really look at that total carbon number. And so once you look at the total carbon, then this tool becomes really important. And I think even in terms of providing the data that allows you to ask for total carbon reporting or, to create, for example, zoning guidelines, which say that on a certain site, you can only emit X tons of carbon dioxide by our carbon neutrality date. In order to calculate how many tons of carbon you're emitting, this tool might be really helpful at that to help shape that policy or for developers to use to understand how to meet the policy requirements.
Yeah.
So I'm curious kind of broadly for our audience who might be interested in keeping tabs on the project or perhaps offering to get involved, is there a way that folks can connect with you or follow along?
Well, we don't really have, right now, this says it's a Siegel and Strain grant, but it's really 3 different groups, 3 different firms, 3 different people. So we can certainly provide, I can certainly provide email addresses to get in touch with me and just, we're trying to stay on top of all the interest at the same time trying to keep moving it forward. We don't have that's probably the best way to do it, is for me to just make my email address available through the Wonder Grant, and then people can contact that way. And we'll try and keep people updated. We don't have a website, so.
That's all right. I think there is definitely a lot of interest. We had a comment from Ariella Granite in the Q&A, just thanking you guys for this amazing work, for seeing a gap and filling it. It's just really, really brilliant. Chris, were there any other questions?
Well, before we're getting ready to wrap up, and I guess what I'd like to do, Larry, Lori, is there anything else that you think we should know? And I know that's kind of a loaded question because there is so much, and if you can maybe narrow it down.
Well, I don't know who our audience is really, but we mostly talk to architects and designers and engineers, and we don't often get to call the shots on our projects. We're sort of working for a client, but I think it's part of our responsibility is to bring this up with the clients always when they're saying, hey, we want to build a new building. We sort of say, well, what do you have now, and could you use it? I mean, just bringing the question up, and not just as a question, but sort of saying, did you know that building a new building over the next 20 years is going to emit whatever, 5 times the carbon of renovating what you've got? And we don't really have time for that anymore. So it's sort of this challenging ourselves and our clients to be a little bit more of an activist as a designer. I think we kind of all have to go there, and it's not always comfortable to do that with the person who's paying your bills. But I think we're kind of there. And I would say educating yourself, if you're a designer, about sort of the relative impacts of embodied carbon versus operational carbon. I think a lot of people are just starting to learn about embodied carbon. And I think it's great. And I think what this tool does, you sort of have to look at the whole package, the embodied carbon, the operating carbon over time, and see which one's the best solution. And that's really what we're trying to do with this tool.
Thank you. Sharon, I'll pass that off to you because I know we're wrapping up.
Yeah, well, Larry and Lori, just thank you again so much for sharing your passion with us and showing off the tool. It's been a really just fantastic session. Thank you also to Erin for all the work that she did behind the scenes on the tool.
Yeah, Erin built the data, the calculator, so we should give all credit to Erin for making.
Yeah, she's the Excel wizard behind.
That's right.
behind the tool. And it really has just come such a long way. So thank you again for sharing. And these Wonder Grant presentations are going to continue for the next 2 Tuesdays at 11:30. So put that on your calendars. And finally, the Wonder Grant 2021 application is open now through June 18th, 2021. So we would love to hear your ideas. You can find that on the One Workplace website. And to our audience, thank you everyone for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. We appreciate the good questions. And we'll talk to you soon.
And thanks to both
Thank
of you
you.
too. You've been
Okay.
great.
Welcome.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
All right.
Larry. Bye, Lori.
Bye.